They thought they could shake down Sylvester Stallone. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Los Angeles had seen its share of tough guys, but few were as determined as the man sitting across from Sylvester Stallone. He wasn't a Hollywood producer, a studio executive, or even a washed-up actor looking for a handout. No, this man played a different game. One where debts weren't settled with contracts, but with consequences. Stallone had dealt with plenty of challenges in his life. He fought his way up from nothing, written his own destiny, and turned himself into a legend. But tonight, someone thought they could push him around. Let's just say, things didn't go the way they expected. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about the legends of Hollywood. Sylvester Stallone didn't come to this restaurant for trouble. He came for dinner. The place was a hole-in-the-wall joint, a classic Italian spot tucked away in a quieter part of town, the kind of place that had been around for decades and never changed. No reservation required, no pretentious decor, just good food and strong wine. He liked it that way. No cameras, no TMZ reporters hiding behind menus, just a dark leather booth and a plate of spaghetti that reminded him of home. Tonight, he had barely taken his first bite when trouble walked through the door. At first, he didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the room. Conversations got quieter. Forks and knives didn't clink as loudly. Even the waiters, usually in a rush, suddenly moved more carefully. That's how he knew. Trouble had just arrived. The man entered like he owned the place. He wasn't tall, but he had presence. A wide-shouldered build, a custom suit that probably cost more than the entire restaurant, and a face that looked like it had been through a war but never lost. The kind of guy who didn't need to announce who he was. Everyone already knew. Big Ray D'Angelo. The name meant something in this city. He wasn't a movie star, but he made money off plenty of them. A businessman, as he liked to call himself. But everyone knew what kind of business he was really in. Protection, loans, collecting debts that people didn't even realize they owed. And right now, he was looking straight at Stallone. Ray didn't come alone. Two guys flanked him, one built like a brick wall, the other leaner, meaner, the type whose silence made people nervous. They weren't here for the lasagna. Stallone set down his fork and finally turned his head. He didn't stand up, didn't look rattled. He just locked eyes with Ray, calm, patient, like he was watching a scene play out in slow motion. Ray smiled, the kind of smile that meant nothing good. "Sly," he said, sliding into the booth across from him without asking. "Been a long time." Stallone didn't smile back. "Has it?" Ray chuckled. "Yeah, you've been doing well for yourself. Real well." He picked up Stallone's glass of wine, sniffed it, and took a sip like he owned it. "Hollywood's been good to you." Stallone watched him, unblinking. "Yeah, I work for it." Ray nodded, setting the glass down. "Sure, but everybody needs a little help now and then, right?" There it was. The setup. Stallone leaned back slightly. "What do you want, Ray?" Ray's smile widened. "Oh, come on. You don't gotta make it sound so businesslike. We go way back." "No, we don't," Stallone said. The smile didn't waver, but Ray's eyes changed. Just a flicker. A moment, but Stallone caught it. The part where a guy like Ray realizes he's not going to get the friendly conversation he was hoping for. Ray exhaled, shaking his head. "You always were a straight shooter." "Ah." He reached into his jacket pocket. Slow, deliberate. He wasn't stupid. No sudden moves. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. Stallone didn't touch it. Ray tapped the paper with 2 fingers. "That's what you owe." Now Stallone did smile. Just a little. Just enough. He finally picked up the paper, unfolded it, and took a long look at the number written inside. Then, he set it down. "I don't owe you anything, Ray." Ray sighed like he was disappointed. "See, that's what I was afraid of. You might think that, but the way I see it, you do. See, back in the day, when you were just starting out, when you were trying to get Rocky made." Stallone's jaw tightened slightly. He didn't like where this was going. Ray continued. "Let's just say, there were people who helped. Maybe not directly, maybe you didn't even know at the time. But favors were done, strings were pulled. You made it big. And now it's time to square things up." Stallone's voice was calm, steady. "I got to where I am because I worked my ass off. Nobody handed me anything." Ray tilted his head, amused. "That's a nice story. Real inspiring. But the truth? Ain't always so clean." The room was quiet, even quieter than before. The air felt heavier, like everyone in the restaurant was holding their breath. Ray leaned in slightly. So let's make this simple. You pay what's on that paper, and we don't have to turn this into a problem. He nodded toward his two men, who still hadn't said a word. They didn't have to. Their presence was the message. Stallone looked down at the paper again. Then, without breaking eye contact, he slowly tore it in half. Ray's face didn't change, but his fingers tapped against the table. Once, twice, controlled, measured. His guys didn't move. Finally, Ray exhaled through his nose and sat back. All right, he said, his voice softer now. I get it. You're not going to make this easy. Stallone took a slow sip of his wine. Nothing in my life ever was. Ray chuckled, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. All right, Sly, you got my attention. But let me tell you something. You might not think you owe me, but in this town, debts have a way of collecting themselves. With that, he pushed himself up from the booth, adjusted his cuffs, and turned toward the door. His men followed, but not before the bigger one, Brick, Stallone assumed, gave him a lingering look. The kind that promised they'd be seeing each other again. Stallone didn't move, didn't watch them leave. He just sat there, swirling his wine, staring at the torn pieces of paper in front of him. Because he knew one thing for sure. Ray wasn't done, and neither was he. Sylvester Stallone knew how this game worked. Ray D'Angelo wasn't the type to take no for an answer. A man like that, someone who built his empire on intimidation, on making people believe they had to play along, wasn't about to walk away without a fight. So Stallone wasn't surprised when, the very next day, he got the call. Unknown number. No voicemail. Just a ring, a pause, and then another. He let it go. Then another call. And another. By the fourth, he picked up. He didn't say anything. He just let the silence stretch. Finally, a voice, low, measured, the kind of voice that only had to be raised once for people to listen. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Sly. Stallone took his time before answering. You always did love to talk, Ray. A short chuckle. You don't like talking? I like straight answers. Then here's one, Ray said. I'm giving you one more chance to make this easy. Stallone smiled to himself. And what happens if I don't? A pause. Then, softer. You won't like the alternative. Stallone exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. He knew how this played out. Ray was old school. He didn't do threats over the phone. No, that was too easy. Too impersonal. This wasn't over. It was just starting. That night, Stallone went about his usual routine. Dinner. Jimmed out a late-night drive along Mulholland, the kind of thing that cleared his mind. But when he pulled into his driveway, he saw it. A car. Black sedan. Tinted windows. Parked just down the street, engine off, but not empty. A stakeout. Stallone sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, thinking. Then, instead of going inside, he did something different. He got out. He walked. Straight toward the car. Whoever was inside didn't expect that. He could see it in the way the driver tensed up, the faint glow of a cigarette ember shaking slightly before it was put out. The window rolled down. The man inside wasn't Ray, but he wasn't a stranger either. Brick. The big one. The guy who had stood silently by Ray's side at the restaurant. Now, up close, Stallone could see the details. Scar on his cheek, thick neck, hands that looked like they'd broken more than a few ribs in their time. Brick didn't smile. Neither did Stallone. You lost? Stallone asked, voice calm. Brick shook his head. Nah. You waiting for something? Brick smirked. Just keeping an eye on things. Stallone tilted his head. You could have done that for the restaurant. What? You get sentimental about me overnight. Brick exhaled, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. Boss wanted to make sure you understood. Understood what? Brick let the silence stretch, then simply said, that you're making a mistake. Stallone nodded slowly, then glanced at the tires. That's a nice car. Brick raised an eyebrow. Yeah? Yeah. Stallone took a step closer. Be a shame if something happened to it. Brick's smirk twitched, just for a second. That a threat? Stallone didn't blink. No, it's a reminder. A long pause. Then, without a word, Brick rolled the window back up. The car didn't move, but Stallone could feel it. He had shifted something. The dynamic. The power. And Ray? Ray wasn't going to like that. The next night, Stallone was back at the restaurant. Same booth. Same meal. Because if Ray thought he could make Stallone nervous, he had another thing coming. Halfway through his meal, the air shifted. Not a sudden hush like before, but a presence. An energy. And sure enough, when he looked up, he saw him. Not Ray, someone worse. A man Stallone hadn't seen in years. Frankie DeLuca. Frankie wasn't a bodyguard. He wasn't a collector. He wasn't even a businessman like Ray. Frankie was a fixer. And fixers? They only showed up when things were about to get serious. Stallone took another bite of his pasta, chewing slowly as Frankie slid into the booth across from him. "Hey, Sly." Stallone swallowed, took a sip of wine, set the glass down. Then, finally, he looked at Frankie. "Hey, Frankie." Frankie smirked, still as cool as ever. "Huh?" Stallone didn't respond. Frankie exhaled, stretching his arms out across the booth. "I gotta say, I didn't think I'd have to be here. Thought you and Ray could work this out like gentlemen." Stallone took another sip. "That what Ray told you?" "Ray told me you're being stubborn." Stallone leaned back. "And what do you think?" Frankie chuckled. "I think Ray's got a short fuse, and you're holding a lighter." Stallone smirked. "Sounds about right." Frankie shook his head. "Sly, I like you. Always have. You done well for yourself. You got respect. You got the public on your side. But you and I both know that doesn't mean much when guys like Ray start pulling strings." Stallone nodded, pretending to consider it. Then, casually, he asked, "What happens if I say no again?" Frankie's smirk didn't fade, but his fingers started tapping against the table. "You really want to find out?" Stallone locked eyes with him. "Yeah." Another pause. Then Frankie exhaled, almost like he was disappointed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, slid it across the table. Stallone didn't touch it. Frankie leaned in. "Last offer, Sly, after this, Ray's done talking." Stallone exhaled slowly, picked up the paper. He unfolded it, looked at the number. Then, just like before, he tore it in half. Frankie sighed, shook his head. Then, without another word, he stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just adjusted his jacket and walked away. But Stallone knew. This time, Ray wasn't just going to send another guy. This time, things were about to get dangerous. The restaurant door shut behind Frankie DeLuca, but the tension he left behind didn't fade. Stallone sat there for a moment, still holding the two torn halves of the paper in his hands. He set them down on the table, right next to his half-empty wine glass. Then he leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't stupid. He knew what came next. Ray D'Angelo wasn't a man who let things go. Frankie showing up wasn't just another conversation. It was a warning shot. The kind that didn't come twice. This was the moment most people folded. Most people took the deal. Most people knew better than to pick a fight they couldn't win. But Stallone had never been like most people. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No calls. No cars watching his house. No more late-night encounters. And that's what bothered Stallone the most. Because silence in this game, it didn't mean they had backed off. It meant they were getting ready. So Stallone did something he hadn't done in a long time. He called an old friend. Late that night, Stallone drove to the outskirts of the city. Past the clubs, past the restaurants, past the mansions of the rich and famous. Deep into the kind of neighborhoods where people didn't ask questions. The gym was still there. It had no sign, no fancy branding. Just a rusted metal door and a single light above it, flickering weakly in the dark. Stallone parked, got out, and knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again. Then, finally, the door creaked open. A pair of tired eyes met his. Mick Romano, a legend in the underground boxing scene. An old-school fighter, the kind who didn't believe in weight classes or rules. And more importantly, a man who had history with Ray D'Angelo. "Jesus, Sly," Mick grumbled, rubbing his eyes. "You picked a hell of a time to show up." Stallone smirked. "Did I wake you?" Mick grunted. "I don't sleep much these days. What do you want?" Stallone stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "Trouble." Mick sighed. "Of course you do." They sat in the back office, an old wooden desk between them. The room smelled like sweat and sawdust, the walls covered in faded boxing posters. Mick poured himself a drink. Didn't offer one to Stallone. Didn't need to. "So," Mick muttered, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "How bad is it?" Stallone leaned forward. "Ray D'Angelo." Mick stopped mid-sip. Slowly, he set the glass down. Then he let out a low whistle. Well, ain't that something? You know him? Mick scoffed. Everybody knows him. I mean personally. Mick's eyes darkened slightly. Yet I do. Stallone waited. Mick exhaled. Ray and I go way back. Not in a good way. Meaning? Meaning, Mick grunted. I owe that bastard a broken nose. Stallone smirked. That's a long list. Yeah, well, I might be the only guy who lived long enough to say it. Stallone's expression hardened. That bad? Mick nodded. You're playing with fire, Sly. Stallone crossed his arms. I've been burned before. Mick studied him for a moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. All right. What's the play? Stallone's smirk faded. I need leverage. Mick was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. You're not gonna like what I tell you. Try me. Mick ran a hand through his gray hair. Ray's got a lot of money. A lot of guys. But the thing he really cares about? Stallone raised an eyebrow. His reputation. Mick leaned back in his chair. Ray built his empire on fear. People don't pay him because they want to. They pay him because they think they have to. Stallone nodded. So if people stop being afraid... Mick smirked. Then Ray's just another guy in a suit. The next night, Stallone showed up at an exclusive club in Beverly Hills. The kind of place where the rich and powerful gathered, where the real business of the city happened behind closed doors. And where, conveniently, Ray D'Angelo just happened to be having a meeting. Stallone didn't go inside. He didn't need to, because Mick had already set everything up. A single phone call. A simple tip. By the time Ray walked out of the club, his smile disappeared real fast. Because waiting outside, reporters, cameras, a whole damn crowd. And at the center of it all, Stallone, standing there, arms crossed, smirking like he had all the time in the world. The moment Ray saw him, he knew. He had been set up. And worse, he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Because guys like Ray, they worked in the shadows. They couldn't afford the spotlight. Ray froze. Reporters shoved microphones in his face. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. Mr. D'Angelo, is it true you've been pressuring Hollywood actors for money? Ray, do you have ties to organized crime? Mr. D'Angelo, is Sylvester Stallone being targeted by your people? Ray's jaw clenched. He was trapped. If he walked away, he looked guilty. If he answered, he gave the story more fuel. And Stallone? He just stood there, smiling. Because this wasn't about words. This was about perception. And for the first time in his life, Ray D'Angelo wasn't the one holding the power. The public was. Stallone didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had already won this round. Ray knew it, and he wasn't going to forget it. Ray D'Angelo didn't sleep that night. Not because of the flashing cameras or the reporters, or even the fact that his name was about to be all over the news. No, what kept him awake was one simple fact. He had lost. For the first time in a long time, someone had beaten him at his own game. And it wasn't just anybody. It was Sylvester Stallone. And that was a problem. Because if Stallone could stand up to him and walk away clean, what stopped the next guy from doing the same? Fear was what kept people in line. And Stallone had just made him look weak. That was unacceptable. So Ray made a call. And by the time the sun came up, Stallone was about to find out. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Stallone was at the gym when the first call came in. He ignored it. Then another. And another. Finally, he picked up. It was Mick. Turn on the news, Mick muttered. Stallone grabbed the remote, flipped on the TV, and there it was. His face. Right next to Ray D'Angelo's. A flashy, bold headline underneath. Hollywood legend takes on alleged crime boss. And just like that, everything changed. The media had turned it into a story. A hero versus a villain. And the thing about stories? They didn't just go away. Stallone exhaled. Yeah, he muttered. Figured this was coming. What's your move? Mick asked. Stallone turned the TV off. The same one I always make, he said. I don't back down. That night, Stallone was leaving a late dinner when he noticed it. A black SUV. Parked across the street. Engine running. Waiting. He didn't stop walking. Didn't speed up, didn't slow down. He just kept moving. He reached his car, unlocked it, and got inside. Then he checked the rearview mirror. The SUV was still there. Waiting. Watching. He smirked. They were trying to intimidate him. Problem was, that wasn't gonna work. So he put the car in drive. and pulled out right in front of them. If they were going to follow, he figured, might as well make it interesting. The game of cat and mouse lasted a solid 20 minutes. Stallone took them through side streets, back alleys, doubled back more than once. But the SUV? It stuck with him. Finally, he had enough. He turned onto a quiet, empty street and hit the brakes. The SUV had no choice but to stop behind him. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the doors opened. Two guys stepped out. Not dressed like mobsters. No fancy suits, no flashy jewelry. Just dark jeans, black jackets. The kind of guys who handle problems quietly. Stallone rolled his shoulders. Here we go. The taller of the two approached first, hands in his pockets. Mr. Stallone, he said, voice calm. Boss wants a word. Stallone smirked. Yeah, he said. He had his chance. The second guy stepped forward. We ain't a skin. Stallone sighed. Then, before either of them could react, he moved. Fast, the first guy didn't even get a chance to pull his hands out of his pockets before Stallone had him against the car, arm pinned behind his back. The second guy? Well, he tried to move. Keyword, tried. Stallone turned, one swift elbow knocking the guy's hand away before he could reach for whatever he was going for. Then, just for good measure, Stallone shoved him back. Hard. He stumbled, barely catching himself. For a second, the whole street went silent. The two men looked at each other. Then back at Stallone. They had underestimated him. Big mistake. You tell your boss, Stallone said, voice low. I ain't playing this game. He let the first guy go, stepping back. I don't know him. I don't fear him. He straightened his jacket. And I damn sure don't run from guys like you. Neither of them said a word. Because what could they say? The Hollywood actor had just put both of them in their place. Without breaking a sweat, the taller guy exhaled, rubbing his wrist. Then he nodded. All right, he muttered. They got back in the SUV. Drove off. Stallone watched them go. Then, finally, he let out a small chuckle. Ray D'Angelo just got the message. Loud and clear. But here's the thing about guys like Ray, they don't stop. They don't let go. They don't lose. At least, not easily. So while Stallone might have just sent a message, Ray had one of his own, and Stallone was about to hear it. Loud and clear. The final move. Ray D'Angelo wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Stallone's little stunt on the street had made him look bad. And in his world, that was worse than losing money. Because if people stopped fearing him, he was finished. So he had one move left. One last shot at making sure Stallone knew who he was dealing with. And it was about to happen. Tonight. Stallone wasn't an idiot. He knew guys like Ray, they didn't just walk away. So he was ready. Which is why, when the black SUV pulled up in front of his house just after midnight, he was already waiting. From his upstairs window, he watched the two men step out. Same guys from earlier. Only this time, they weren't coming empty-handed. One of them had something in his jacket. A gun? Maybe. Didn't matter. Stallone smirked. These guys still thought this was their game. But he had one last surprise for them. Because this time, he wasn't alone. The front door swung open before the men even reached it. And standing there, Mick flanked by three other guys. Old school. Ex-fighters. Guys who'd been through real battles. Guys who weren't afraid of some mobster's goons. The two men stopped. One of them glanced around. The other exhaled, shaking his head. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. They had expected Stallone alone. Instead, they had just walked into a problem. Mick took a step forward, arms crossed. You boys lost? He asked, voice calm. Neither man answered. Because what could they say? They weren't here for a fair fight. But now, that's exactly what they were looking at. The second guy, the taller one, tensed, like he was thinking about making a move. Mick just smirked. I wouldn't, he muttered. And then, the front porch lights flicked on. And from the shadows, Stallone stepped out, hands in his pockets. Casual. Like he wasn't the slightest bit concerned. Like he already knew how this was gonna end. The two men looked at him, then at Mick, then at the three other guys standing behind him. Yet they had lost. Again. The taller guy swallowed, then took a step back. Message received, he muttered. Mick nodded. Good, he said. Now get the hell out of here. And just like that, it was over. The men turned, got back in the SUV, drove off. Stallone watched them disappear down the street. Then he exhaled. Mick smirked. Well, that was fun, he said. Stallone chuckled. Yeah, he muttered. For now. Because he knew how guys like Ray worked. If he wanted to end this, he had to make one last move. And he knew exactly what it was. The final call. The next morning, Stallone made a phone call. Not to the cops. Not to a lawyer. But to someone who really knew how to handle guys like Ray, someone with real power. Someone who could make problems disappear. Forever. The call lasted less than a minute. And when it ended, Stallone smiled. Because now, it was really over. The aftermath. By the end of the week, Ray D'Angelo had vanished. No headlines. No police reports. Just gone. Some said he skipped town. Others? They weren't so sure. Either way, one thing was clear. Nobody messed with Sylvester Stallone. And lived to brag about it. The legend grows. A few nights later, Stallone was at his favorite restaurant. Same old booth. Same old glass of red wine. He sat back, relaxed, peaceful. And as the waiter set his meal down in front of him, the man smiled. On the house, Mr. Stallone. Stallone smirked, took a sip of his wine. Then he leaned back and chuckled. Another fight. Another win. Just another day for the underdog. The end.